Hello everyone, Panzer J's back with a new video, and this video is going to be on Axis and Allies 1914. So it is a World War I board game. This will be a solo gameplay. So I've just recently finished up Historical Board Gaming's Global War 39 and Axis and Allies Global 1940. So we'll get into a little bit of World War I action. This is actually going to be my first time playing this game. I've never actually had the opportunity to play against a human opponent. And actually, this is going to even be my first time altogether playing this. So I'm going to have to reread through the rules because it's been a little bit since I read through the rule book. So undoubtedly, I'll probably make a few mistakes here and there. So try not to beat me up too much in the comments. We'll see how this goes. The map is set up for the initial conflict to start in 1914. So you have the Central Powers, which are Germany here in the gray, Austria-Hungary, green, and the Ottoman Empire in a kind of dark turquoise kind of color. As far as the Allied powers, you have Britain over here in kind of a light off green. You have the French in the blue, the United States here in the olive green, Italy in a kind of a light brown, and Russia in a darker brown. So those are the participants in the conflict. Obviously, this is going to be a lot different game that I'm used to in terms of playing the World War II games. As far as ground units, you just have infantry and you have artillery right now. Tanks are available in the game, but I think they're available in 1917, so it takes a couple of years into the conflict before tanks are available. And those are the only ground units that are available throughout the conflict, are infantry, artillery, and tanks. For air units, you just have fighters, and there's a French one right there in Paris. And that's the only air units. And then for naval units, we've got battleships. This is a British battleship. Cruiser behind that, and then a transport behind that. And then there's also submarines. These are two German submarines in Sea Zone 5. So those are the only 4 different kinds of naval units. So obviously not nearly as many units in this game. And this is much more of a, as World War I was, trench warfare. So you're not going to see units blitzing through and picking up territories. As a matter of fact, once a country invades another territory, you don't continue to fight out for that territory on multiple rounds of combat until one or the other is defeated. You move into a territory, and then there's just a single round of combat. And then if neither side was taken out in that round of combat, then both countries occupy that same territory, and that's kind of like signifying the trench warfare of World War I. So it's definitely much more of a slogging match in this game than the World War II games that I'm used to. But still, it's a very popular game. Excited to get into it and see how we do. So everything's set up on the board. Over here, we've got the roundels, the coasters for each of the 8 participants here. So on this side here, on the left, we've got the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. And then we've got Russia, France, Britain, Italy, and the U.S. And that's in the order that they perform their turns for each side. We got a bunch of dice here, as you can see. A bunch of dice came with the game. In this game, you're going to have a lot of, obviously, infantry and artillery. So you need a bunch of dice to signify each of the units there. We've got the battle board that shows us the attacking and defending powers of each unit. So for the attacking infantry, they would attack at 2. If they have artillery support, that brings them up to a 3. Offshore battleship bombardment is a 4. Attacking artillery is a 3. And then artillery, if you have air supremacy, obviously the presence of fighters, that brings the artillery up to a 4. We have some roundels for each of the countries here, depending on if they take any territories. And then the boxes for each of the participants. And for each nation, it has their setup chart on the front of the box there, along with their starting income. So for the U.S. here, you got $20. And in the United States itself, 6 infantry, 2 artillery, C-Zone 1, 1 battleship, 1 cruiser. And that's an example of what each of those boxes might have as far as unit placement and territories to start the game with. So that's an overview, a quick little overview. Hopefully going to get into this later today, and we'll do a turn-by-turn recap video and put it all together and see what we got. Again, this is going to be the first time I've actually played this, so I'm sure there will be mistakes here and there, but we'll see how it turns out. Okay, folks, so turn 1 has been completed in Axis and Allies 1914. A little bit of slow going here on turn 1. A lot of the countries just kind of maneuvering their forces around, either moving the infantry and artillery around the board, either to launch attacks in the upcoming turns, or possibly just beefing up their defenses for an anticipated attack. So Austria-Hungary goes first, and as part of the game, they are required to go into Serbia. So that's something they have to do. And that went well for Austria-Hungary. They went ahead and took out all of the units that were in Serbia. So that is not a contested territory. That is full Austria-Hungary. And then not too much else. They just kind of maneuvered some forces around, moving units onto the border with Russia, possibly going into Russia on turn number 2. They also came down and moved some more units into this territory bordering with Italy. Russia itself responded. They came down, moved some units into Romania, and again, just kind of beefed up territories that are adjacent to territories of the Central Powers. Moved some units down into Sevastopol, possibly as a prelude to going into Mesopotamia and attacking the Turks. The Germans had $35 to spend. They bought a couple of fighters, some men, and some artillery. Germans looking to maintain the air superiority they currently have. They already start the game with 1 fighter. So they came into this Russian territory here on the border with Silesia. And they didn't outright take that territory. As you can see, there is a man and artillery left, but the Germans do have overwhelming forces in that territory. They've got about 5 men, 6 artillery, and a fighter, as well as a bunch of units ready to reinforce that. So it doesn't look like Russia really has a lot that can go into that territory, so probably the Germans will take that, and that'll become an uncontested territory and pure German here in turn 2. Besides that, they just maneuvered some forces on the Western Front into these 2 territories bordering France right here, just going ahead and building up an offensive punch possibly onto turn 2. They did not go into either Holland or Belgium. They stayed away from that, and again, just wanted to kind of bring together as many forces as they can for a bigger push. They also came down here at the border with Italy to combine with the Austrian-Hungarian forces, in case the Italians maybe had a thought of invading. Now with that combined German-Austria-Hungary force, that's more than a match for what the Italians have. The Germans also had some success at sea. They came over here in this sea zone here and took out all the British naval units that were there, which I believe was a battleship, 2 cruisers, and a transport. And the Germans lost a cruiser, a sub, and then had a battleship damaged. Also, one of their subs had gotten hit from the mine when they entered this sea zone. And then over here in Sea Zone 2, they were able to take out a cruiser and a transport at the cost of a sub. So at the end of the Germans' turn, the British did not have any naval units at all in the Atlantic. For the French, they maneuvered their fleet here. They took the naval units they had in the Med, came up and combined with the naval units that were off of Brest, and now they've got one powerful fleet in the mid-Atlantic. And they also just continue to maneuver units around in France. They did go into Belgium, so they got the money for Belgium and was able to activate those ground units for the French cause. And again, just moved a bunch of units into Lorraine, trying to beef up the defenses with the border with Germany. As far as the British, they did go ahead and buy a battleship and a cruiser. They've got to try to get these German naval units off the board so that the British can start putting down transports and moving men and artillery onto the European mainland. So they have to, go ahead and get rid of these last couple of German naval units. So they definitely need to put money into the Navy. Besides that, they maneuvered down here in Africa a little bit. And then in the Mideast, they put, I believe, a couple of infantry and an artillery in India. And they came up and invaded this Turkish territory of Transjordan. And again, that's not contested. That went completely for the British. They kind of brought an overwhelming force anyways. The Turks just had 2 men and an artillery. And Transjordan fell. And they also dropped a couple of guys in Arabia and activated that for the British cause. So some good maneuvers for the British in the Mideast. As far as the Turks, they came up and took Bulgaria, activated that for the Ottoman Empire, and got the ground units for that. They had bought 3 artillery and a man that was put in Constantinople. And again, just like most of the nations here in turn 1, just maneuvered things around. Put a bunch of units into Mesopotamia, and then came down and put a bunch of units down here to possibly block this British invasion from Transjordan. The Italians brought a couple guys over from Libya back to the Italian mainland, and then simply moved men and artillery up the boot of Italy, again bordering with Austria-Hungary so that they can repel that possible invasion. The U.S. saved their $20. No sense in really spending their money. They can't get it unless they're attacked directly, which is pretty much definitely not going to happen. The U.S. can't get in the game until turn 4. And in this game, unlike many of the World War II games, there's no industrial complexes. So you're not limited to the number of units you can place in a given territory. So if you save up $100, you can spend that full $100 on units on that turn. So there was really no point in spending the U.S. money. So they saved their $20. And that's where we're at the end of turn 1. Not a lot of action. I think things will pick up here starting in turn 2, since most of the nations have their armies maneuvered into position to go on the offensive here in turn 2. Okay, turn 3 is now in the books for this game of 1914, and things are proceeding along, but at a slow pace. But again, that's reminiscent of the combat in World War I. Austria-Hungary goes first in turn sequence, and they kind of just maneuvered some units around. They moved up some more units into the border with Italy. So I'm expecting a clash with the Italians here on turn 3. They also moved a bunch of units into Romania. So Romania completely fell. That was a contested territory, and now it's all Austria-Hungary. And they've got a stack of about 18, 19 men, 8 artillery, and a fighter. So they're poised to do some serious damage to Russia. Austria-Hungary also bought a couple of subs. They had seen an opportunity to possibly break out into the Mediterranean and maybe cause some havoc among the Allied warships. But as we're going to see here in a minute, I'm not sure that's going to happen now. As far as Russia goes, they bought just men and just trying to hold on. I mean, we're only 2 turns in the game, and already Russia is in a lot of trouble. They do have a decent sizable force down here in Sevastopol, in the Crimea, but not sure that's going to hold off the Turks. And then again, Romania has got a huge stack of Austria-Hungary forces. And then Germany completed the conquest of Poland on this turn, and they got about a dozen men, 9 artillery, and a fighter. So Russia really doesn't have a whole lot left, and we're only 2 turns into the game. As far as Germany goes, they bought a couple of subs. They moved what was left of their fleet off of the coast of England back to their naval port. So this battleship is going to get repaired this turn 3 for the Germans. And then bought, again, a couple of subs to try to prevent the English from building up a transport fleet to land in Europe. Maneuvered some men around. They took Belgium from the French, moved a couple of fighters up, and just slowly moving men and artillery to the Western Front, to the border with France. Bought 5 more artillery and a fighter as well, so they've got a lot of air units, 4 total on the board. 1 they've deployed to the Eastern Front, and 3 they're going to be doing battle in the West. That was about it for Germany. France, again, much like a lot of the nations at this early stage of the conflict, just maneuvering things around. So they moved up a bunch of men and some artillery to the border territories with the Germans, bought another fighter for themselves and some artillery, came down and landed in Portugal and activated that for themselves. And then they brought their 2 battleships up here to Sea Zone 8 to back up what the British had there, which the British only initially had a battleship and a cruiser. Then the British themselves went ahead and bought 2 more battleships, and they're in Sea Zone 8. So now the combined might of the French and English equate to 5 battleships right now, so more than a match for what the Germans have in the waters of the Atlantic. They also came down, moved a couple of guys down here, so they're in position to take this German territory, Togoland, on turn 3 here. That was about it for the French and the British. The British also did put some artillery and men down in India. They saw that the Turks had massed a lot of units here on the border with Arabia, so they took everything from Transjordan, came over into Arabia just to kind of consolidate everything to put up more of a defense in case the Turks get a little squirrely and want to engage in a fight. So that left Transjordan open, and then the Turks just came in and took that back. The Turks themselves just maneuvering stuff towards Mesopotamia and the Syrian desert here because of the 2 different forces the English have in Arabia and India. Thought about going into Sevastopol as the Turks from Mesopotamia. It would have been about a 50-50, so they could have at least probably had Sevastopol contested, put even more pressure on Russia, but then the English would have just been able to come into Mesopotamia themselves, and the Turks got enough to worry about with the English down here, so they're just going to be content to kind of just hold what they got and build up defenses. They built some more men and artillery in Constantinople. Down in Africa, Again, kind of just maneuvering around. Both the Germans and the English are trying to get all of their units maybe together in one territory and then launch an attack. In Africa, to start the conflict, a lot of single infantry and a couple single artillery spread throughout, especially the southern portion of Africa. So both countries kind of just maneuvering around each other, trying to position their forces into maybe a single territory to launch more of an offensive punch. The Italians can see the writing on the wall here. Venice is probably going to come under attack this next turn, so they're just continuing to move all their units up the boot of Italy. They now have about 20 men and 7 artillery in Venice, so that's going to be a slugfest. They did come over here and activate Albania, so that was $2, and they got the men for that. And now, as you can see, Austria-Hungary really has nothing down here bordering Albania. Everything is either up by Italy or in Russia. So now Austria-Hungary is going to have to react to this to stop Italy from just kind of gobbling up some of these empty territories. And then as far as the naval presence in the Med, once Austria-Hungary put down those couple of subs, the English moved this fleet here of 2 cruisers, a battleship, and a transport that were over here in Sea Zone 28 and moved them into the Atlantic. So now in this, in the Mediterranean. So now in this Sea Zone 17, with the Italians and the British combined, you've got 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 2 transports. So that should be more than enough for the Austro-Hungarian battleship, cruiser, and 2 subs. So now, with those 2 allies having combined their fleets, probably put a stop on the Austria-Hungary's plans to break out into the Med. Financially, Germany's leading the way with $42. Austria-Hungary is at 31, and the Turks are at 19. So that's what the Central Powers are looking at. As far as the Allies go, the Entente, the British are at 31. The French are at 26. Russia's still at 25, surprisingly, but that's poised to definitely go down here in the upcoming turn. America's still at 20, and Italy is at 16. So that's where things stand economically. I expect the action to start heating up here for turn 3. Most of the countries in Europe have maneuvered their units around and look to be ready to start some serious action here on turn 3. Turn 3 now in the books for this solo game of Axis and Allies 1914. And things definitely heated up a little bit more here in turn 3. By the end of turn 2, most of the nations had pretty much maneuvered all their armies into position, and the war truly broke out here on turn 3. So starting with Austria-Hungary here in the green, they came into the Ukraine and destroyed all but 1 Russian infantry. So that territory is still contested right now, but obviously that will become fully Austria-Hungary's here on turn 4. So they'll get the $3 for that. They did come into Venice, didn't take it completely, but it is contested, and they've got about 7 artillery, an infantry, and a fighter left in Venice. They did lose Trieste right here, worth $4. So they're sitting at $24, but that can easily be taken back this turn. Austria-Hungary's got a bunch of units right bordering that territory, and again, the Ukraine's going to be fully theirs this turn. So Austria-Hungary's looking pretty good. They bought just men this turn, put them in Vienna, and they also did buy 1 fighter. As far as Russia, they're in rough shape here in the brown. They're kind of backed up just to Moscow and this territory here, Tatarstan. Not a whole lot for them to do. They built just infantry. I mean, they do have a sizable force there, but they've got Central Power armies right at the doorstep to Moscow, both with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and even the Turks came into Sevastopol this last turn and completely took that. So Russia's down to just $18, and Moscow looks to probably not fall this turn 4, but at least become contested. The Germans, good news on the Eastern Front, not so much on the Western Front. They bought a transport and a couple of subs along with a bunch of men. They did come over and take out the Russian battleship over here. I believe they lost a sub to the mines, and then the battleship here received some damage. Again, they took all of Belarus. They took Livonia here and are at the doorstep to Moscow, so that's the good news. They also reinforced the Hungarian army down in Venice. They moved all their stuff in, so that territory for the Italians might fall this turn. But on the Western Front, they're in some deep trouble here. The French launched an attack in a couple of different territories. They took complete control of Belgium, and Lorraine was already contested. It still is, but the Germans are now down to just artillery and a man. That's it. The French brought in 2 fighters. The Germans had 2 fighters there, but the French won the battle for air supremacy. So, and if you take a look here, Alsace, right behind Lorraine, is completely empty. In the Ruhr, the Germans got 3 infantry, 3 artillery, and a fighter. And that's pretty much it on the entire Western Front. Everything else is back in Germany itself, really. So the Germans are probably going to have to let the Eastern Front make do with the units that are already there and put almost everything into the Western Front here and to try to deal with the French. Germany is making $42. And at the end of their turn, I think they were up to about 44. They lost a couple dollars on some of the Allied turns, but they're making the most money in the game, so that's good. But again, they're going to have to deal with the Western Front. It's going to probably have to be full-on production, all spent to deal with the French here. Also, the British went ahead and bought 4 transports this turn, and you've got this combined French-British fleet here off of Wales. That's 5 battleships, 3 Allied cruisers, and like 7 transports. So the German Navy can't hope to compete with that. So the British are definitely going to be able to land a bunch of these units in Europe this turn 4. So just to add even more difficulties for the Germans. They might have made a mistake coming down into Venice. They maybe should have used all those units on the Western Front. We'll see if that is a decisive factor. In Africa, the French came over, took this German territory. The British came in here, and they lost 2 units to the Germans 1. So now it's a one-on-one infantry battle here. The British did bring a couple of guys over to Anglo-Egypt-Sudan off of this transport. They didn't want the Germans to simply start taking these empty territories and getting that free money there. So Africa looks like now there's nothing in Africa on either side except for infantry. So see who can get the better die rolls here. It's kind of like even in Africa. The Turks did come over and took Egypt because that was empty. They also came into Arabia and didn't completely take that. It is contested, but the British just have an artillery and an infantry left. And then again, as mentioned earlier, the Turks came up and took Sevastopol, and they still have 3 infantry and artillery there. And now that territory is completely theirs. The British did buy a couple infantry they placed in India. They haven't moved off of India yet, just because they're still not strong enough, I don't think. They could probably take Persia, but then the Turks have enough in Mesopotamia that they're not going to go any further than that. And the British have been splitting most of their income towards buying stuff to drop over here in London, especially the last turn when they bought these 4 transports. They want to start getting into Europe itself. Italy just bought all men. They reinforced Venice. Hopefully Venice can hold on at least as a contested territory for another turn until the Allies can maybe come over and help. They did take Trieste, which only had a single Austrian-Hungarian infantry in there, so they took that. And that was about it. The U.S. saved their money again. here on turn 3. So we're going into turn 4, and that is the turn the U.S. can enter the conflict, and that's also the turn that tanks can start being purchased by any of the powers. So financially, the Central Powers are actually in pretty good shape. Germany leads the way with $42, and then both the Ottomans and the Austrian-Hungarians are up to $24 each. Actually, Austria-Hungary is down, I would say, from 26. They start to 24, but they're in a position to take a couple territories back. And the Ottomans are up from 16 to 24, so the Turks are really doing well right now. And not really, if you look at Turkey itself, really not in danger of having to deal with any kind of Allied incursion, honestly. For the Allies, or the Entente, financially, Britain is at 29. The French are at 26. The Italians actually are at 24. The Russians are down to 18, and the U.S. is still staying steady at $20. So not too bad. I think what's going to happen here is, again, coming up, Russia is going to be backed up just to Moscow, it looks like. So the Eastern Front is definitely going to be securely in the Central Powers' control, but the Western Front is where things are looking a little dicey, and especially with the U.S. being able to come into it this turn, see where they want to land, whether they come right for France and land there, maybe come over to Africa, or even somewhere in the Mediterranean here. So things heating up, and expect that to continue into turn 4. So some interesting developments at the end of turn 4 here in this game of 1914. So the United States is now in the conflict, as well as tanks are now able to be purchased by all the combatants here in World War I. The Central Powers, it's still a little bit too early to tell, although I think it's starting to tilt against the Central Powers a little bit. So here on the Eastern Front, Austria-Hungary took full possession of the Ukraine. They also took Trieste back from the Italians, also took Albania and Romania. So Austria-Hungary had a really good turn. They continued the conflict in Venice. And as you can see, the Italians still have units there, so that's still a contested territory. But Austria-Hungary is up to $36. So Austria-Hungary is looking to be in pretty good shape right now. You really can't say the same thing for Germany. Now, Germany did use a transport. They took a chance that this naval base, because the naval base, this sea zone is mined for Russia. The Germans took a chance, brought a transport in. It did not hit the transport, so they were able to drop off these men. And they took Finland and Karelia. So that was $4 for Germany. They also went into Moscow. So now Moscow is contested. But the Russians just have a huge stack of stuff in there. The Germans did get altogether about 13 hits. But the Russians got at least that number back. So right now, at the end of that round of combat, the Germans got 5 artillery, a man, and a fighter, and the Russians still have 16 men, or 17 men, and 14 artillery. The only saving grace is that the Austrian-Hungarians are right next door here in the Ukraine, and they've got 14 men, and I believe 8 artillery. Also, this fighter here in Romania can reach 1, 2. So on Austria-Hungary's turn here coming up at the beginning of turn 5, they'll move all that in there. Now, it probably isn't going to be enough to completely wipe out the Russian forces in Moscow, but it'll take them down some and will mean that probably Russia will not be able to expel these guys when you combine Austria-Hungary with what Germany already has in there. So, and then also the Ottomans, the Turks, moved up one territory, so now the Russians are collecting a single dollar down here in Kazakhstan. Down in Kazakhstan, they're collecting just a single dollar. So at least they've pretty much neutered the Russians down to almost nothing. But that's the only good news for Germany. On the Western Front, Lorraine fell, Alsace fell. There was nothing in Alsace, so the French were able to take that. Also, the British made their landing. They landed in Belgium, and the French just continue to move up. So in Belgium, you've got about a dozen French infantry, 8 British infantry, and about 10 artillery. The French also bought 3 fighters. Lorraine's got a decent amount of units as well. So Germany's definitely feeling the pressure on the Western Front. The Germans did buy 5 tanks and 6 men. And they're just trying to pump out as many units as they can to get them on the Western Front to at least throw up some blockers here, especially now that the British have landed in Europe. The Americans are now in the conflict, and they spent all their money and bought 5 transports and 10 men. So they'll be able to start moving those units around here on turn 5. In Africa, things continue to kind of go back and forth. The British added an infantry in Belgian Congo, so now it's 2-on-2 there. The French moved up another territory, and then the British did come over, took a transport and landed here in Egypt, and took that back from the Turks, but then left that transport sitting by itself, so the Turks came over and wiped that out with those 2 cruisers. Plus, the Turks also moved a bunch of stuff into Transjordan, so they got about 8 men and 6 artillery and a fighter ready to come over into Egypt on this next turn. So Africa might actually turn a little bit towards the Central Powers, but it'll just be a question of if the U.S. wants to come over and land in Africa with their units and kind of tip the balance back towards the Allies. The British dropped a couple of tanks in India. Still didn't go forward, so Persia's still, at this point, neutral territory. Turks and British kind of just staring at each other over the Persian territory there. The Turks bought a bunch of men, dropped them in Constantinople. As far as Italy, they're down to just $12. Bought all men, put them in Rome. Venice is still contested, and the Central Powers really are, what they've got there is really getting whittled down. So I'm not even sure Venice will fall. It just might stay contested for a little bit. So Italy might have some breathing space there, but not really a whole lot Italy can do. That's where we stand at the end of 4 turns. See how things shape up. Don't expect Moscow to fall this turn. Just continue to be contested and see if the Germans made a mistake by putting so much on the Eastern Front that the Western Front maybe will just kind of fall apart on them here. We'll see what happens in turn 5. Turn 5 completed, and I'd have to say that the Allies, the Entente, has definitely grabbed a hold of control in this game. This might be the shortest Axis and Allies 1914 game ever. It is the first time playing it, so maybe that has something to do with it. But things aren't looking so hot for the Central Powers. First, let's take a look at Russia. That was the big development that swung in the Allies' favor. So Germany just had 5 artillery, a man, and a fighter in Moscow. Austria-Hungary came over and beefed up those defenses with, I believe, 14 men, like 7 artillery, and a plane of their own. And on the combat rolls for Austria-Hungary going into Moscow, they took out about a dozen Russian infantry, which was good. But the Russians rolled the lights out in return and wiped out everything Austria had except for a man, I think 2 artillery, and a fighter. So then on the Russians' turn, they went ahead and attacked in this contested territory of Moscow, and they completely wiped out everything the Central Powers have left. So as you can see, Moscow is now uncontested, free of enemy units, and the Russians still have 14 artillery and 3 infantry. And the Central Powers have almost nothing left in Russia at all. They've got a couple territories with, like the Germans do up here, with a man each. The Turks have a man and artillery down there, and that's it. So not only is Russia now collecting money and able to deploy units again because Moscow's not contested, they're just going to be able to come out and start taking all these territories. And the Central Powers really have nothing, not only in those territories, but even to send that way, because the Germans especially have enough on their hands on the Western Front. So the Eastern Front looks like it's going to swing decidedly in the Allies' favor. In the Western Front, the French and British continue to move up. They took the Ruhr, and then just continue to move units up. So in the Ruhr itself, you've got about 10 French infantry, 8 British infantry, and about 10 French artillery. A bunch is in Alsace, artillery, men, and a plane. And then in Belgium, you've got more British and French, all of artillery, planes, and men. So the Germans got their hands full. They did beef up over here in Kiel. They've got about 10 men, 5 tanks, and they've got some more tanks and men coming from Berlin. But the Ruhr itself is worth $6, so the French are really starting to eat into the German economy, and I'm not even sure the Germans have enough on the Western Front right now to even repel what the Allies are bringing. The French and British combine their fleet up here, so I wouldn't be surprised if an incursion against this German high seas fleet is in the offing, maybe in the next turn or two. The Americans, now fully in the conflict, brought their 5 transports with 10 men, and then a battleship and a cruiser as escorts. They're now at the mouth of the Mediterranean, so they'll be able to make their way into the Med and start beefing up the Allied defense in Africa. As far as Africa itself, that was one of the few bright spots for the Central Powers. The Turks came into Egypt with quite a bit of force. That's about 8 men, a half a dozen artillery, and a plane. And as you can see in Africa, the Allies basically just have a few infantry scattered. So at least for the next couple of turns, the Turks are going to be able to get control of Africa. That'll help. We'll see what happens with this U.S. force over here, though. That'll definitely be able to respond to what the Turks are doing. In Italy, Venice finally fell after 2 or 3 turns worth of a contested territory. The combined attacks of first Austria-Hungary and then finally Germany cracked the defenses and took Venice. So that went German. The Italians just bought men again and moved up here in Tuscany. So they've got a dozen infantry there. I don't think the Central Powers have enough in Venice to come down, but Austria-Hungary has been moving some units over. They've got some men and some tanks ready to come in from Taurellia. So we'll see how that goes. And Austria-Hungary just built 12 men. Over here in the Middle East, the British now are starting to spend a bunch of money since they already have enough going on in Western Europe, especially with the French forces as well. They went ahead and spent a bunch of money in India, bought some more tanks and men. So now they're looking at about 10 men, 3 artillery, and a half a dozen tanks ready to probably invade Persia this next turn. The Turks do have a decent amount in Mesopotamia and bringing some other stuff over. They see the writings on the wall there that the British are probably going to make a move here fairly soon. And that's where things stand after turn 5. I'm expecting the U.S. to land in Africa here on turn 6. Expecting the Western Allies to continue to push into Germany. And Russia's definitely going to break out from Moscow and start taking some territories back. So as far as income goes, the Central Powers are, for now, and still in pretty good shape. Germany's collecting 36, Austria-Hungary 36, and the Turks are actually up to 27. So that's $99 total, so not bad. But again, a lot of the territory, especially in Russia, is just empty territories that Russians going to take back. So I think even economically, things will start turning against the Central Powers. We'll see what happens after turn 6. Turn 6 all complete. And a little more action heating up, especially on the Western Front. Things have improved slightly for the Central Powers since the end of turn 5. Some nice developments. The U.S. Has finally started making their presence felt, landing in Europe. But let's take a look at the Eastern Front first. So Russia had come out and taken the Ukraine back, as well as Belarus. They built all men. They didn't have a whole lot of money. I think they had like $8, so not too much. Thinking about venturing out a little bit, but they want to build up their forces as much as they can. So Russia had taken 2 territories back, but the Turks already came back and took Ukraine. Austria-Hungary came over. Piedmont is now under their control. And they have all of Venice as well. So now they're at the doorstep to Tuscany. They had moved 3 tanks and 6 men over into Venice. So on turn 6 here, they're going to be able to attack Tuscany with 8 infantry, 3 artillery, 3 tanks, and 2 fighters. The Italians just have about 16 infantry in Tuscany. The Germans also came over to help beef up Piedmont with an infantry and 3 artillery. So now they're at the doorstep of France. So France and the Allies had to respond. This stack of tanks that was in Paris, the French wanted to send them up here to engage the Germans up here in this part of Europe. But with the threat coming from Piedmont, they had to send the tanks down there as a kind of a blocker. The U.S. also had their 10 infantry, wanted to land in Africa and beef up the Allied presence there. But again, with Marseille wide open and this combination of the Austro-Hungarians and Germans being able to move out of Piedmont, the U.S. had to land in Marseille as another blocker. On the main fighting on the Western Front, the Germans came into the Ruhr, and that was contested, and the Germans had a great round. By contesting the Ruhr, the French now do not have access to those $6 that the Ruhr is worth, so that was huge in and of itself. But then as far as the combat, the Germans got 18 hits on their turn. And when the French and British combined forces there responded, they got just 10 hits, and 5 of those hits were discarded because of the presence of these 5 German tanks able to absorb those hits. So the French and British only took off 5 German infantry for the cost of losing 18. So that was a huge victory for the Germans. The French have subsequently moved more units back in there. But the way it looks right now, I think the Germans still have a slight edge, and they also have more units coming, a couple more tanks, a bunch of men. The British used their force and came up and took Belgium from the Germans. The French had also moved down here into Munich. So taking a few more territories from the Germans, they've got the Germans down to only collecting $31. That's the lowest they've been at in several turns. But I think the Germans have kind of stabilized what's going on the Western Front, and they've been putting all their money the last couple turns into the Western Front. As far as Austria-Hungary, they moved up into Galicia with a stack of about a dozen infantry and a couple artillery, so they're going to start moving into Russian territory to try to again put Moscow under siege, and maybe this time around it'd be able to actually take Moscow. The Turks also came over into Sevastopol with a stack of about 8 men and 5 artillery, so they're also going to make their way slowly up to Moscow. So maybe a combined Ottoman and Austria-Hungary force can possibly take out Moscow this time. As far as the British, they just moved some men around, got some transports going from over here in Canada, moving them around, landed some more units in Europe itself, built another 4 infantry they placed in London, and the rest of their build they had to put in India because the Turks are starting to build up quite the economy right now. So most of the British efforts probably in the next couple turns is going to be spent on dealing with the Turks. As far as the Turks go, again, they came up into Sevastopol, starting to put pressure on Russia there. They did move some men up into Mesopotamia, which was empty after they moved into Sevastopol. So they got a decent stack of men there. And they've got another 2 stacks of men and a couple of tanks coming right behind it. The big move they made was down in Africa. They broke out from Egypt, sent a man to Libya, and sent the rest of the force, which is still about a half a dozen artillery men and 1 fighter, down into Anglo-Egypt, Sudan. So they are poised to really continue down into Central and Southern Africa and be able to help out these 2 German infantry that are all the way down here in the Union of South Africa. So right now the Turks look like they can get complete control of Africa. It's going to be slow going. These units only move 1 space per turn, and all these territories are only worth $1 a piece, but it all adds up. So, and again, the U.S. was going to land in Africa to help out, but with what the Germans and Austrian-Hungarians are doing over in Piedmont, they had to block there instead. The U.S. does have another force, but that's only 4 men and 2 artillery. Depending on how combat goes on this turn, they'll either land in France again to reinforce there, or possibly land here in Africa to try to start clearing out some of these Turks. The British, again, they had spent most of their money in India. They went ahead and finally took Persia. I think they lost a single infantry, so they've got a stack of about 8 men, 4 artillery, and 5 tanks ready to break into Mesopotamia this turn. That should go fairly well for the British, but then again, the Turks got a bunch of units, including a couple tanks right behind there. So as far as the Italians go, they're down to just collecting $8. They had 12 this last turn, so they just bought 4 infantry, put them in Rome, and moved everything else up into Tuscany, knowing that this turn probably is going to see Tuscany being invaded, and then you're right next door to Rome if you're the Central Powers. So Italy's just barely hanging on right now. As far as the income goes, the Turks are the big story. They're collecting $31, and they only start with 16, so they've nearly doubled their income by the end of turn 6 here. Austria-Hungary still strong at 36. Germany is actually, based on what they start the conflict at, down to $31. So they're actually right now the weakest link of the Central Powers. France is at 39. Britain is at 29. The U.S. staying strong at 20. Russia is at just $8, and Italy is down to just 6. So the French and the British are really going to have to carry the load for the Allies going forward. We'll see how things progress after the end of turn 7. Turn 7 is done, and let's take a look and see what's going on. Not a great turn for the Central Powers. I think the game is kind of tilted again back to the Allies, the Entente. This game definitely has a lot of ups and downs. I'm not sure if this is typical of this game or just maybe my lack of experience playing it and not engaging in the proper strategies for each of these countries. But over on the Eastern Front, the Austria-Hungarians moved up. So just outside of Moscow here in the Ukraine, they've got about 10 men and 2 artillery. The Russians just built more men, so since the last couple turns, since Moscow had been contested a few turns back, Russia has built up a decent force again. That's about 10 artillery, and they're up to about a dozen men. So Austria definitely cannot take Moscow with that. They do have some more stuff in Galicia, but that's got to move up another turn. That allows the Russians to put more units down here. And the only force for the Central Powers that's coming towards Moscow is from the Austrian-Hungarians. So I'm not sure Moscow is going to fall. I have a feeling that Russia is going to hold on. Not that they're really doing much, but if the game goes on much longer, a few more turns, Russia is going to start breaking out from Moscow and taking some of these territories back. So we could see a resurgent Russia here soon. Besides that, for Austria, Hungary, they went ahead and came down here and engaged the Italians in Tuscany. So that territory is now contested. They don't have a ton left. Austria-Hungary doesn't. About 4 men, 3 artillery, 3 tanks, and a couple of fighters. Now, they were backed up with a German man and 3 artillery, but still not a whole lot. Italy's got about 15 men in Tuscany, so I'm not sure that's going to fall. And the problem there is the U.S. had landed in Marseille at the end of the last turn, and in this turn they moved up to Piedmont. So not only did they get the $3 back to Italy for Piedmont, but that's about 10 men and 2 artillery. So I'm not even sure that the Central Powers are going to stay in Tuscany. They might have to pull out. So I think Rome is gonna be safe. And I think that's kind of the theme of this game so far, as both is in the case with Moscow when the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians attacked Moscow and just didn't quite have enough to take Moscow and they held on. It's going to be the same thing with Italy. Italy's pretty much bottled up down into Rome and Tuscany here, but I just don't think the Central Powers have quite enough to break through. And now with America landing over here in Italy, I think it's just going to be just a little bit a case of just not enough for the Central Powers. They haven't been able to knock out any one of the allies yet, and the allies are starting to push back. You might even see both Russia and Italy eventually a little bit resurgent here and going on the offensive themselves. On the Western Front, kind of a stalemate. The Ruhr, the French have taken a little bit of beating there. The Germans have moved a bunch of stuff up. They got a stack of 6 tanks, some artillery there, down to just a couple of men, but they have a bunch of artillery and men in the territories right behind the Ruhr. So that will probably continue to be contested this turn. The British pulled out of Holland just because the Germans had way too much on the border with Holland. So the British pulled back a territory. The French built more tanks and men. And now with the Americans having landed in Marseille and taken Piedmont back, the French were able to move their units out of Burgundy, moving them towards the Western Front, closer to deal with the Germans. The British got some men and an artillery on transports ready to come over from Canada. The U.S. has a stack of transports that dropped all those men in Marseille the turn before. They're starting to make their way back to the United States to grab up these units the U.S. have on the east coast of the United States. In Africa, things looking better for the Central Powers, and that could have been yet another mistake that I made, is putting too much into Africa for the Central Powers as far as this Ottoman force here. It's definitely going to sweep down and take these remaining Allied territories, take out these 2 Allied forces. That's a stack of about 8 artillery, 4 men, and a fighter. And some of the men have broken off from the main force there and are starting to take up these territories one at a time. But all these African territories, with the exception of Egypt, are only worth $1 a piece, so you're not going to get a ton of money. So that could have been a mistake, putting such a large Ottoman force into Africa. But things are getting bottled up down here at the tip of Africa here, so expect things to finish off here in Africa maybe in the next couple of turns. But then the Turks have their own issues over here. The British came into Mesopotamia the turn before, so the Turks counterattacked and they lost a bunch of men. The British have those 5 tanks there, so those tanks were able to absorb 5 of the hits the Turks got. So the British lost, I think, a single man to about 5 for the Turks. And what that did is not only is this territory in danger from the British, but then the Turks did have a substantial force up here in Sevastopol, a bunch of artillery and men, which they were going to move up this Russian territory here to Tatarstan to put them at the doorstep to Moscow to assist with the Austrian-Hungarians' attack on Moscow. It still might not have been enough to make Moscow fall, but they would have had a much better chance. But with the British excursion into Mesopotamia, most of these units that were in Sevastopol had to come down into Mesopotamia. So now the Turks have no force in position to threaten Moscow. And then the Turks just continue to move more stuff up. This is going to be a big battle. I think this territory is going to be contested for a while. Both sides have tanks. Both sides have decent forces. So I don't think that this battle is going to be decided one way or another for a while. The British put most of their money in India, 6 men and a couple of fighters. So now the British will have air superiority in their battles with the Turks here. As far as any kind of naval conflict, not much has happened. The Suez is now closed to the Allies because of the Ottomans' control of Egypt here. So they can't, none of the Allied ships can come over here and try to take out these couple of Ottoman cruisers. But the U.S. now had moved a battleship and a cruiser into Sea Zone 17. So now the Allies got a bunch of ships here. So I'm expecting maybe the Allies to move in and try to take out the Austria-Hungarian fleet there. Between the Italians, the British, and the U.S., they have 3 battleships and 4 cruisers. So maybe one right after the other, they all go in there and try with a combination of the 3 of them, take out that Austro-Hungarian fleet. So that's where things stand at the end of turn 7. Central Powers trying to hold on here, but I think Rome is going to survive and start pushing the Central Powers back in Italy. We'll see what happens on turn 8. Turn 8 completed in this solo game of Axis and Allies 1914, and it continues to be a back and forth affair. Some good news and bad news for both sides. Over here on the Eastern Front, the Russians just continued to drop infantry in Moscow. They only collected a couple, $6, so it was only 2 infantry, but they'd have a nice stack both of infantry and artillery. Not only has Russia been holding on, but I think here in the next turn or two, they're going to start busting out and taking some of these territories back that are lightly defended or not defended at all right now by the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary does have a substantial force in the Ukraine right at the doorstep to Moscow, about 16 men, a couple of tanks, a couple artillery and a plane, but I don't think it's enough to take Moscow. And Austria-Hungary's got enough problems elsewhere that they really can't spend any more resources on the Eastern Front. So I think you're going to see a resurgent Moscow or a resurgent Russia here in a couple of turns. As for Austria-Hungary over here, they pulled out of Tuscany, saw the writing on the wall. The Italians still had about 15 men plus the U.S. landing in Piedmont. They had to retreat. And then they do have some more units coming in from Tyrolia. So I don't think the Allies are going to go into Venice anytime soon. But the big news was by pulling back, that relieved the pressure on Rome. So Italy's not in any imminent danger of falling. And because of that, they were able to break out. They brought a transport with a couple men, landed in Albania, took those couple of dollars off of Austria-Hungary, and now are poised to take up some of these empty territories. So Austria-Hungary is going to have to go ahead and start diverting resources down south to deal with the Italians. Also, we had our first naval battle in a while. The British came in here and took on the Austrian-Hungarians. They knew they weren't going to win, but they wanted to whittle that navy down. They took about half the ships, and then the Italians followed that up with a battleship and a cruiser and finished off the Austrian-Hungarian navy and suffered just a damaged battleship in return. So that was a lot of the good news for the Allies, the Entente. Over here on the Western Front, though, the Germans pumped more units into the Ruhr, and the French suffered a colossal defeat in the Ruhr. The Germans got 17 hits And that left just a single man and an artillery for the French. And in return, the French did get 8 hits, but the Germans got the 7 tanks there, so they absorbed 7 of the 8 hits. So the Germans lost a single infantry, while at the same time inflicting 13 artillery and 4 infantry losses on the French. So that was a huge victory for the Germans. And then the French went ahead and pulled their couple of units back. So the Ruhr then, $6 for the Ruhr was all put back in the German bank. So, and then the Germans also dropped a bunch more artillery and a man in Berlin and are bringing up more men. So the Germans got quite a force moving through German territory at the border with France now. The French also pulled back from Munich. There's not much that they could have done there. They just had a man and a couple artillery. The Germans were going to take Munich back, so they didn't want to lose the units at the same time. The French did move a bunch of stuff up into Belgium. They finally got their tanks at the doorstep to fight, a bunch of men, and they got more tanks and men that they bought that are going to be slowly making their way up. The British went ahead and landed in Belgium as well with a bunch of units, so that would be quite the battle if the Germans decided to go into Belgium on this next turn. Not sure they're going to. Each side has now tanks, and they're about equal number of tanks at that. And the Allies have the advantage in infantry, while the Germans do in artillery. The Air Force actually is +1 for the Allies as well. So the Germans will probably hold off at least a turn there. And that's about it for Europe. The U.S. Continuing to do their shuttling service, moving transports that have dropped stuff off in Piedmont, making their way back through the Med into the Atlantic to come over and pick up some more units in the United States. And then these transports got a couple of tanks, 3 artillery, and 5 men that they're making their way over to the Med. Not sure where these guys are going to land now that Rome is fairly safe. They actually might land in Africa and try to start taking back some of the territory that the Central Powers have been gobbling up in Africa. And as you can see, there's a lot of crescent moon markers on the board in Africa. That's all Ottoman territory now. They've taken all that from the Allies, and they've got the Allies bottled up right down here in the Union of South Africa and Southwest Africa. So I expect both those territories to fall this turn 9. So that'll give the Ottomans all of Central and Southern Africa, and then they'll start moving their way over to the west, trying to take up these last few territories that belong to the Allies. But again, the U.S. might possibly be landing to stop those plans. Over in Turkey, this was a big win for the British. The British reinforced Mesopotamia, and they had 5 tanks. So they inflicted, I believe, like 8 casualties on the Turks, and the Ottomans in return, because the British tanks absorbed so much of the hits, I think they only ended up losing a single infantry. So this battle is definitely starting to tilt in the British's favor. The Turks did bring up more units. They brought a couple tanks, and now they're up to 4 tanks in this territory, about 10 men and about 5 artillery. But the British spent their entire build on India, tanks, a man, and an artillery. So they're starting to slowly move things from India through Persia to Mesopotamia. So I think this battle is definitely tilting in the British's favor, causing the Turks really to spend everything to help reinforce that. They definitely don't want the British to break through and get some of these easy territories and start threatening Constantinople. And consequently, the Turks have almost nothing left in any of the original Russian territories. That's the way things stand after 8 turns. See how things look after turn 9. Turn 9 is complete. And let's take a look at how things shaping up. Things have slowed down a little bit these last couple of turns for both the Allies and the Central Powers. Kind of just maneuvering armies into position. On the Eastern Front, the Russians did break out and took Karelia back here. That was empty. Besides that, they just dropped some more men in Moscow and are holding tight. Austria-Hungary bought 5 tanks and a man and are slowly moving more units into the Ukraine here. I think this stack of artillery and these men will go into the Ukraine here on turn 10, and maybe turn 11 we'll see another battle for Moscow. See how that shapes up. Down in Venice, Austria-Hungary moved some more units into Venice to beef up the defenses there. On the Western Front, there was no movement at all. The French and the British moved more units into Belgium, so they've got a ton of stuff. Some tanks, planes, men, and artillery all in Belgium. And the Germans basically did the same, moving into the Ruhr. They've got a stack of about a dozen artillery, 16 men, about a half a dozen tanks, and a couple fighters, and more on the way. The Germans built a bunch of tanks that turn. So it looks like battle into Belgium might be the decisive battle on the Western Front. We'll see. No naval action. The Germans definitely don't have enough strength here. They got 4 subs, a cruiser, and a battleship. Not nearly enough to take on the combined French and British fleet. And the French and British, they could have went in there, kind of done a 1-2 punch like the Italians and the Americans did in the Med on Austria-Hungary, but the German fleet's battle up there, not going anywhere, so the Allies figured, why bother? The U.S., they came over and moved down in Tuscany with about 13 men and a couple artillery. So now that's combined with about 15 Italian infantry, so it's going to make it extremely difficult for Austria-Hungary to go in there. And then they landed in Marseille with about a half a dozen men, 3 artillery, and a couple of tanks. So the U.S. is definitely starting to get more and more units into Europe. And then they moved these 3 transports over to start picking up some of the stuff that they just built, these couple of tanks, and some other units that they had already in the United States. In Africa, that continues to go the Central Powers' way. The Turks came down, took the Union of South Africa, and now have just Southeast Africa left under Allied control, all in the entire southern and central portion of North Africa. This lone Turk infantryman making his way over. He'll take Togoland back for the Germans this next turn and start making his way over. So the Central Powers, mostly the Turks, taking all of Africa for the Central Powers. That was the good news for the Turks. The bad news is Mesopotamia still continues to be contested. The British did launch another attack in there. They brought some more units up, and it didn't go horrible for the Turks. They lost 7 infantry. The British lost 4, so it was only a net loss of 3. But the British continued to pump a bunch of units into India. You got another 4 tanks, a man, and artillery ready to come over from Persia next turn, and then some more artillery and a man in India. The Turks just built 11 infantry this turn, so they're going to start moving their way over. And then the British came up and attacked the 2 Ottoman Empire infantry that was in Sevastopol with their 6 infantry, and they took them out and didn't receive any hits in return, so now Sevastopol is back under Russian control. And now the British are in a position to maybe they can go over here and maybe into Romania, go up to Tatarstan, just depending on what they want to do, or they could come back down and come into Mesopotamia. So the British got a few options over there. Financially, we're looking at Germany is leading the way at $41. Austro-Hungarians have taken a little bit of hit. They're down to 29, and the Turks, Ottomans are at 35, so they're doing good. As far as the Allies go, France has 35. Britain is down to 25. The U.S. holding steady at 20. Russia's back up to 13, and Italy's at 12. So it's still pretty even across the board, both in terms of the military and economic aspects of it. We'll see how things shape up at the end of turn 10. Turn 10 is complete, and again, we have a little bit of a back and forth action. The Eastern Front has been pretty quiet for the last couple of turns. Germany took Karelia back. Other than that, Russia just continues to build up its defenses in Moscow. And Austria-Hungary continues to move units into the Ukraine for a possible attack. I don't think it'll come here on turn 11 because this stack of tanks still has one more move to get to the Ukraine. So think possibly on turn 12, Moscow will be assaulted again. I think it'll be 50-50 whether Austria-Hungary will actually be able to take Moscow. On the Western Front, the French and then the British fouled up and moved into the Ruhr. So that is now contested. So the good news for the Allies is that denies the Germans the $6 for the Ruhr. But the bad news is the French lost, I believe, like 15 infantry to like 4 or 5 for Germany. And then the British made a mistake here. Should have just moved the British in without actually engaging in combat. They should just add it to the defenses of the French. Instead, I actually attacked with the British, and they got completely, almost completely wiped out. They're down to like 3 artillery, a man, and a couple of planes. They do have air supremacy, but other than that, the Allies kind of took a beating in the Ruhr, and the Germans have more tanks coming right behind it. They still have a stack of about 12 artillery, plus they can move over here in this territory that's adjacent to the Ruhr. So I'm expecting the Germans to continue the attack. I don't think they'll necessarily evict the Allies on this turn, but they'll whittle them down some more. Germany has definitely taken the upper hand in Western Europe. As far as the U.S. and the Italians, they're a combined force. They moved up into Venice, so they took those $2 back, so that was good. And the U.S. landed some more units right behind in Piedmont. But Austria-Hungary is building up their own forces here in Trieste, and they also in Vienna have a stack of men and artillery. So I'm not sure that either side will have the upper hand. I think that'll be more of a stalemate, depending on if combat erupts here on turn 11. The U.S. just continue to shuttle forces over. They've got 3 transports with 3 men and 3 tanks ready to land, enter the Med on this next turn. And they got a stack of 5 transports making their way back over to the United States. In Africa, the Allies are down to just a single infantry in Africa itself. The Turks took southwest Africa, wiped out all the Allied units down there, and then this single Turk infantryman is going to start making his way over and taking these empty territories. So the U.S. could possibly land in Africa instead and try to start taking some of these territories back. But they're only $1 a piece, so not a huge deal. And this Turk force is way out of position, only being able to move 1 space per turn. They're not going to be able to get back into any kind of fight for probably 4 or 5 turns at least. So the U.S. might just continue to land in Marseille and Piedmont because of the substantial forces Austria-Hungary has. In Mesopotamia, that went totally Britain's way. They launched another attack and took out like another 10 Turk infantry without losing. I think they lost a single infantry in return. So the Turks pulled out. They retreated to Ankara. They left just a single artillery, which that can't be. That should actually be a man, so that's a mistake. But so they'll have left a single infantry in Mesopotamia just to keep that contested so that the British can't bust out of Mesopotamia this turn. And they pulled back to Ankara, the Turks did, built some more tanks and men that'll add to Ankara before the British can actually go in there in the following turn. So we'll see how that plays out. The Italians did land here in Transjordan. The Med is free of Central Power ships, so they landed in Transjordan, took $1 off the Turks. So they're still collecting, the Ottomans are still collecting $34, pretty substantial, especially when they start the game with 16. But they're starting to feel the crunch now. The Italians and the Americans are free to move wherever they want in the Med, so they can start landing in Turkey. And then again, this is a huge British force that's just about to take control of Mesopotamia and keep moving on. So that's the way things stand at the end of turn 10. We'll see what happens in turn 11. Turn 11 is in the books, and we're all quiet on the Eastern Front at this point in the war. Russia just doing their usual, building men, putting them in Moscow for the inevitable clash. Austria-Hungary moved up some more units into Ukraine, so I'm expecting here on turn number 12 to possibly have a battle for Moscow. Austria-Hungary definitely won't take it in one turn. It'll be contested. And even then, I'm not sure Austria-Hungary has the juice, but I think they're going to give it a go. Besides that, Austria-Hungary continues to beef up their defenses in Trieste outside of Venice. The Germans, again, another good round for them in the Ruhr. So the Allies just pulled back into Belgium. So now the Germans get the $6 back for that and still have a formidable stack of tanks and artillery. So the Western Allies, as far as France and Britain, are definitely on their heels. Wouldn't be surprised if the Germans push into Belgium this turn as well. The French bought all infantry. The British bought all artillery. And for the first time in several turns, all their units they placed in London, they didn't place anything in India. The combined Italians and the U.S. just moved more units into Venice. So the U.S. has about 15 infantry, a couple of tanks, 5 artillery, and the Italians have maybe around a dozen men. So Venice is fairly well defended. The U.S. continues their shuttle service, moving transports back and forth. They did go ahead and land in Africa. So these 3 transports have 3 tanks, 3 men. The Turks had taken this British territory, so the U.S. landed and took it back. They wanted to stop the Ottoman Empire from continuing to get free, empty territories. And now with this U.S. force, maybe they can start coming back and taking some of these territories back, although the Turks do still have a substantial force, about 6 or 7 artillery, a man, and a plane. So that's probably about an even match against these 3 U.S. tanks and 3 U.S. infantry. So we'll see how that plays out. In Turkey itself, the British went ahead and Mesopotamia is no longer contested. It is pure United Kingdom territory now. So that's $3 up for them. The Italians took back Arabia for the British. And the Turks again pulled back from Ankara, left a man both in the Syrian desert and Ankara just so that it'll be contested. The British will wipe it out in one turn, but nonetheless. And then the Turks are building up quite the force here. They've got probably about 19 infantry, 11 tanks and artillery, and then 4 more tanks and 4 more infantry coming from Constantinople. So once all these are combined for the Turks, I'm not even sure this British force can take them. So I think the Turks will start going on the offensive here and taking back some of this territory. And again, the British didn't put anything in India this turn because of what's going on with the Germans on the Western Front. See how things play out after turn 12. So turn 12 is complete, and things have heated up a little bit more. The Austria-Hungary here on the Eastern Front went into Moscow, and it was about a 50-50 in terms of the casualties inflicted and received. And this is going to be real close. None of the Central Powers don't have any units even remotely close to come in to back this up. Russia can't put down any new units because Moscow is now contested. So it's basically what's in Moscow is what's going to be duking it out here. And again, it's going to be real close. Austria-Hungary's got 2 infantry, about 9 artillery, 7 tanks, and a fighter. The Russians have 6 infantry and about a dozen artillery. So it's going to be close. I think the tipping point in favor of Austria-Hungary is the tanks. Every time Austria-Hungary attacks, those 7 tanks absorb 7 hits. So I think that is going to slightly tip the balance in AH's favor, but we'll see. Also, on the Western Front, The Allies finished pulling out of Belgium. They've got one man left in there. The Germans are definitely on the march here. Again, the tanks are the big thing. I've discovered that that really is a lot of times the deciding factor. You launch an attack with 10, 12 tanks or whatever. There's 10 or 12 hits that you're absorbing from the defender. That's huge. I mean, you end up with situations where, like, the Germans the last couple turns have inflicted, say, 15 casualties, and the Allies firing back, maybe they get 15 hits, but the Germans absorb 12 of them with their tanks. So now it's a 15-3, and there's just no way to sustain that. So the Allies have pulled back. The Germans will go into Belgium, or continue into Belgium, finish that off, and take possession of Belgium. And really, things are not looking good. The British had to drop more men in London, so they'll be able to land with these 5 men and 5 artillery. But the French slowly getting pushed back, and the French have just been buying all infantry just to have some kind of defense for the home French territories. The U.S. just continuing their shuttling service with their transports. They did land some tanks in Africa, and they've got 3 men there as well. So this looks like a pretty decent force to combat what the Turks have down in Central Africa. So we'll see how that plays out. Although it might have been a mistake to drop the U.S. tanks here. All these territories are only $1 a piece. It's almost, for the Allies just to say screw it and let the Central Powers hold on to that. It might have been better for the U.S. to land in Piedmont again. Everything is up in Venice. You got about, altogether between between the Italians and the U.S., probably about 25 men, a tank, and about 5 artillery. Austria-Hungary, at the same time, has built up about half a dozen tanks, 3 men, about 10 artillery and 3 fighters. So they do have air supremacy, and they've got more men and artillery coming. So the Austrian-Hungarians did launch an attack in Venice this last turn. They inflicted, I think, about 10 to 12 casualties, but received a few in return. Even with the half a dozen tanks they have absorbing those hits, they still lost about 5 to 7 men, I believe. In Turkey, the British took Ankara. They took the Syrian desert, so they're moving up steadily. That's a half a dozen artillery, about 15 men, and about 10 tanks, along with a couple fighters. Although, if you look at what the Turks have, that's about 25 men and about 15 tanks, and more tanks and artillery in Constantinople. So I'm not sure the British now have the ability to finish off the Turks. The British might actually have to pull back. I'm not sure if they should continue to go forward with all of those Ottoman tanks ready to get into the battle. So that could be a little bit of a seesaw action in Turkey. In India, the British put down 3 men and 2 artillery. They split their money between London and Italy. They did move up into Sevastopol and took that. So that gave $3 back to Russia, but with Moscow being contested, they can't spend any money, so that didn't help. But there's a bunch of empty territories here that these British forces can move into and take back some more money, possibly Romania, Ukraine, and whatnot. So that's where things look at the end of turn 12. I think the Central Powers have kind of gained the upper hand here. The battle for Moscow and Venice will both continue. The Germans expected to move deeper into France. See how things shake out after turn 13. Turn 13 completed, and things are looking pretty bleak for the Allies, the Entente, in a little bit of trouble here. So the battle for Moscow continues, and I believe the Austro-Hungarians inflicted 12 casualties to 3 for the Russians. They did get 9 actually total, or 10 total, but the 7 Austrian-Hungarian tanks absorbed those hits. So Austria-Hungary came out +8. So it's just a matter of time right now. The Russians are down to a single infantry and 8 artillery against 8 artillery, 1 man, 1 plane, and 7 tanks. The British do have this force coming up from the Ukraine, but it's just a man and 3 artillery. That's not going to do much. It still might not fall this turn, but I'm assuming the turn after that. So by turn 15, Moscow will have fallen, and that'll be one of the 2 capitals the Central Powers need, the other one being either London or Paris. So things not looking good on the Eastern Front for the Allies. Again, the British did come up in the Ukraine. They couldn't give that $3 back to Russia because Moscow's contested, but at least it took $3 off of the Turks. And there are a bunch of empty territories here they can move into, but this isn't much of a force. And once Austria-Hungary is done dealing with the Russians, I'm sure they'll turn on this force of British. Over in the Mideast, again, a little bit of a setback for the Allies. They didn't lose anything in battle necessarily, but the British pulled back from the Syrian desert and Ankara. There's just too much that the Turks have built up. That's 15 tanks, about 26 men, about 5 artillery. So the British pulled back to Mesopotamia. They got some more units coming from Persia and India. Maybe make a stand there. But the British are having to divide their money between London and India, while the Turks are pouring everything into Constantinople, obviously. So that might be a race that the Turks win. The Turks did go ahead and buy 4 subs this turn, now that Constantinople is kind of not under threat anymore. They went ahead and figured they can move these couple of cruisers they have over here up through the Suez. Now with these 4 subs, maybe take a run at the Allied ships off of the coast of Italy. If they can succeed there, completely clear the Allies of any ships in the Med, that would prevent the Italians from using their transport to move any more men around. So the Turks getting a little aggressive now in terms of naval units. In Africa, again, the Allies pulled back. We'll take a look at the Western Front in a minute, but because of developments on the Western Front, the U.S. pulled most of their units off of Togoland here. They didn't have enough transport to take everything, so these 3 tanks and this 1 man are going to kind of be left there. Nothing they can do about it, and they're just going to leave Africa for the Turks. That's just the way things have played out for the Allies. The U.S., again, continuing the shuttling services. These are the units that were in Togoland. They're moving up. They're making their way towards France. So are these 3 transports with 3 men, 2 artillery, and a tank. And the reason why everything's heading to France is because the Germans have built up quite the force. They took complete control of Belgium, and the French and British pulled out of Picardy, so now they're all holed up in London. The Germans, that's about 15 tanks, about 20 artillery, 3 planes, and 6 men. So the Germans have a huge offensive punch coming. So the British landed forces in Brest to help the French, and everything's been pulled back into Paris. They do have quite the defense there. That's about 25 French infantry alone, about 10 tanks, and about 10 artillery. But the Germans, with all these tanks that they have that can absorb so many hits, the Germans will probably move into Picardy this turn. They'll take Lorraine. So that's $4 more they'll gain by denying the French those $4. So economically, as well as militarily, things have definitely taken a turn for the better for the Central Powers heading into turn number 14. Turn 14 is complete, and the game continues to tilt more in the Central Powers' favor. In Moscow, the Russians are still holding on, but just barely. They're down to 2 artillery and 1 infantry. And again, a deciding factor has been these Austro-Hungarian tanks. 7 tanks at 7 casualties the Austrians can absorb, and that just tilts the casualty differential way in Austria-Hungary's favor. So Moscow will definitely fall this coming turn. That'll give the Central Powers their first capital, and then they'll only need to take either London or Paris, and they will have won the game. So the Eastern Front is about to be secure. The British did move into Galicia with this small force, but they're going to probably get stopped. I don't think they're going to get taken out this next turn, but Austria-Hungary will probably move into Budapest. They'll drop some new units in Vienna. So not much longer before that British force is wiped out. In Turkey, looking to gear up to a major clash. The Turks have put everything pretty much into the Syrian desert. The British have responded by pulling stuff back to Mesopotamia, and they do have some stuff coming up from Persia. So both sides have a tremendous amount of units, a bunch of tanks on each side, a bunch of infantry. So that kind of looks like that might be a stalemate. Whoever goes into the other's territory, it looks like that territory will be contested for quite a while. I don't see that battle being decided for several turns. And that will, in effect, kind of stall the British, so the Turks won't have to worry about that. In Africa, they continue to move up. The U.S. pulled back. They now don't have the forces in Africa to resist this stack of Turk artillery, the one man and the one fighter. So the Turks will just continue their conquest of the rest of Africa. And now that they've kind of stalled the British in Mesopotamia, they don't really have to worry about that threat either. On the Western Front, the French did move up into Picardy. So now Picardy is contested, so the Germans aren't getting the $2 for that. And the French did come in with about 10 tanks. So they inflicted a decent number of casualties. But the Germans also hit really well on their die. So even with the French absorbing about 10 of the casualties, the Germans still took about 8 units off the French. So that battle is about 50-50 right now. The Germans do have men in the 2 adjacent territories that'll move up to reinforce. But the British landed in Picardy, or moved up, I should say, and then the U.S. landed in Picardy with this force here. So the Allies, it's pretty much all or nothing at this point. They've got to hold the Germans back from Paris. So pretty much everything, not just from the French, but the British and even the U.S. now is going towards the defense of Paris. The U.S. has got this force, about 5 tanks, 2 fighters, and 4 men ready to land in Picardy on turn 15. And the Germans will just continue to pump units in. The stuff they dropped down in Berlin, slowly one territory at a time, making its way over to reinforce Picardy. As far as down here in Venice, nothing happened there. Austria-Hungary continued to move units up into Tyrolia. So they've got a nice stack of units there, including about 8 tanks. The combination of the U.S. and the Italians, there's about 35 infantry there. So that's going to be a slogging match. Austria does have the tanks to absorb some of the hits, but not sure that they're going to go into Venice this turn. They might hold off a little bit. Plus, they want to take care of this British excursion over here into Galatia. As far as new units placed, the Central Powers getting a little aggressive and starting to build naval units. So as you can see here, over here off the German coast, they built a bunch of subs as well as a couple battleships. So now the German high seas fleet really starting to take shape. There's a total of 6 subs, 3 battleships, and 2 cruisers. So the British had to respond by dropping a couple of cruisers down, because even with the French fleet there as well, the balance of power was starting to tilt into Germany's favor. And even though they do want to put more ground units to beef up the attack into France, Germany's definitely not against building even more naval units. If they could build enough of a navy, come out and take out the Allied navy, then they don't have to worry about the British being able to land units and reinforce France, and even give the U.S. some trouble as far as being able to land units. Although the U.S. did respond by building a couple battleships and a sub. So I'm not sure Germany might be able to take out this fleet up here, but If the U.S. and Britain are both building naval units, not sure Germany's got enough money to outbuild what the Allies can put on the board. Also in the Med, Austria-Hungary built a couple of battleships and a cruiser. So since they do not have any of these territories that have the naval marker here, these mines are still active. So even with no Allied ships in these waters, if the Austro-Hungarians and the Turks with their navy want to come out, they still have to roll to try to survive the minefield. Now, it's only a hit on one on a 6-sided die, so you figure maybe you'll get a couple of hits. But thinking about bringing out the Turks and the Austro-Hungarians, maybe even making their way out of the Med, or at the very least kind of closing off the Med here in Sea Zone 16. So we'll see how that plays out. Economically, Germany's up to $49, so they're far and away bringing in the most money. We'll see how that plays out on turn 15. Turn 15, all complete. And the Western Front continues to see a seesaw back and forth effect. On the Eastern Front, though, Moscow fell. Austria-Hungary collected that money. And now the Russians are down to just a single territory with a single man here in Finland, which these 3 German infantry and Karelia are going to attack on this turn 16. Austria-Hungary is going to start pulling units out of Moscow now, start taking back some of these territories like the Ukraine. Sevastopol make their way down there. This British nuisance force of an infantry and 3 artillery moved into Poland, and they're 1 territory ahead of all the Central Power units on this Eastern Front, so they're going to still cause a little bit of a headache for the next turn or two until the Central Powers can catch up with that force. On the Western Front, after the Germans had a lot of success the last couple of turns, it's now turned against them here in Picardy. The Germans are down to just 3 tanks and an infantry. The French counterattacked into Picardy, had a handful of tanks that they were able to absorb hits from, whittled the Germans down quite a bit, and then the U.S. followed up with a landing. And even though they didn't have a lot of offensive punch, just 4 infantry and about a half a dozen tanks, they actually hit 6 times. And the Germans only hit a couple times in return, and the U.S. had more than enough tanks to absorb those hits. So the Germans are in rough shape in Picardy. They're going to have to pull back and start bringing some more units up, maybe into Belgium here. But not sure if they even want to make a stand in Belgium, because the French can just move in this next turn, and they're up to about 15 tanks they've got now. So the Germans might have to sacrifice these 3 tanks and this man and just pull everything back into the Ruhr and bring up some stuff that they've got in Berlin. Also, the Germans are going to have to forego spending money on a navy for at least a couple turns to put a bunch of ground units on the board with what the French have coming up from Picardy. The British didn't do a whole lot. They built 11 men, put them in London. Going to use these transports to start coming over. The U.S. bought a fighter, a couple of infantry, a couple of tanks. They're going to use these 3 transports to start bringing stuff over. In Africa, not much happened. The U.S. just continuing to retreat, and this Turk force of artillery, a man and a fighter, just moving their way up. The Ottomans will continue to take territories one at a time here, each worth $1 apiece. In Turkey itself, the British pulled everything back out of Mesopotamia into Persia, plus had moved some stuff up. So they've got quite the force in Persia, about 20 men, about 12 tanks, about 10 artillery, and a couple of fighters. A lone Italian infantry was left in Mesopotamia, so that's now contested. The Turks bringing up units. They've got a stack of about 25 guys, 10 tanks, and a half a dozen artillery in the Syrian desert. They got another 6 guys in Ankara, and then 7 artillery and a man they placed down in Constantinople. So that they're going to try to combine all that into one territory, move their way over. It'd be quite the showdown between the British. The British didn't spend any money in India this turn because they wanted to start bringing some stuff over into France. They had those 5 transports just sitting there with no units to bring over, so they spent all their build in London this turn. So, but with such a substantial Ottoman Empire force moving their way probably into Mesopotamia this next turn, the British might have to start focusing exclusively on India. Again, that's probably about a 50-50 battle right now. Had some naval conflict. The Austro-Hungarian Navy, a couple of battleships and a cruiser came out here into Sea Zone 17, and the 2 battleships, the mines hit on both of them, so they were both damaged. So then first the Italians came over with a battleship and a cruiser, and took out the cruiser and one of the damaged battleships. The U.S. followed that up with a cruiser and a battleship, and they took out the other Austro-Hungarian battleship, lost their cruiser and a battleship damaged. The Turks just combined all their navy over here into Sea Zone 19. So that's 4 subs, a battleship, and 2 cruisers. The problem is you come in over here, you're going to not only face this U.S. battleship, which is damaged, but the mines. And then you try to come over here to this territory, this sea zone, and there's another mine field you got to deal with, or mined waters, because of Marseille's territory. So not sure it's even going to be a smart move to even venture out, even with no Allied ships here in the Med. You just got to deal with these, the seas being mined. So probably not a whole lot of sense for the Central Powers. They might just kind of, especially this Turkish Navy here, might just lurk back. And then if the Allies do venture back in, maybe come out and try to take them on. So maybe just more of an intimidation factor for the Central Powers. In Venice, not a lot happened. Austro-Hungary did attack and whittled down the combined Italian and U.S. forces a little bit. The Italians didn't counterattack. They do have like about 22, 23 infantry, so that's a decent amount, but they're only going to attack at a 2. And Austria-Hungary has about 10 tanks. So the chances are, any hits they get would just be absorbed, and then they would just have lost infantry when Austria-Hungary rolled. So they didn't do anything. They just stayed right where they are, kind of leaving the initiative to Austria-Hungary to see if they continue their attack here on turn 16. We'll see what happens going into turn 17. Turn 16 complete. And for the Central Powers, the Eastern Front's almost completely under control. Just this one territory here of British 3 artillery and 1 infantry that keep escaping. The Central Powers attempt to chase them down, but they're slowly running out of territory. So that'll probably, that force will be wiped out either this turn or the following. And that'll leave all of Russia, all of the Eastern Front under the Central Powers' control. In Italy, the Italians pulled back from Venice, left 1 man there, pulled back to Tuscany, and the U.S. pulled back to Piedmont. So Austria-Hungary will probably move into, will take Venice from a contested territory to theirs. And Italy is just going to basically hole up in Rome at this point, and hopefully the Allies can come to the rescue before Rome falls. It'll take a few turns for Austria-Hungary to make their way down there, but they definitely have the upper hand there. On the Western Front, the British moved into Belgium. The Germans have pulled back to the Ruhr, and they do have a bunch of units coming from Berlin. So the Germans will probably coalesce all these forces into one territory, maybe Hanover, and that would give them at that point about roughly 20 tanks, 10 men, and about 6-7 artillery. But the Allies have definitely gained the upper hand on the Western Front. Lorraine is now back to French controlled, and they've got a huge stack of men, artillery, and tanks making their way up from Picardy. So Germany's going to have to devote all their money to ground units for the time being. The navies continue to kind of just stare each other across the waters there. No action as far as naval combat goes. The U.S. continuing to shuttle their forces around and continuing to back up in Africa, letting the Turks take one territory at a time. Africa is almost completely devoid of Allied units at this point. Over in Turkey, big showdown coming. The Turks moved everything into Mesopotamia, so they took control of that territory back. The British here in Persia, not sure the British get to go in turn sequence before the Turks. Don't know if they're going to go into Mesopotamia and try to take out a bunch of these units. They do have about 13, 14 tanks that can absorb hits, but the Turks have a ton of men, a bunch of tanks and artillery, more coming. So the British might have to pull back to India and start spending all their money in India just to try to save that. That's where things pretty much stand. The Austro-Hungarians did come over here into Sea Zone 17 here and take out the damaged U.S. battleship. So the Med is now free of Allied ships. And this Turkish Navy of 2 cruisers, 4 subs, and a battleship waiting in Sea Zone 19 just in case the Allies wanted to come back into the Med. The problem for the Allies, even with all the good news on the Western Front, is the financial situation. The top 3 money makers right now are all the Central Powers. Germany bringing in 43, Austria-Hungary 42, and the Turks 36. So, and the top Allied country is the French at 30. So, definitely the economic balance has swung heavily in the Central Powers side. We'll see how things turn out after turn 17. We have arrived at the end of turn 17, and not a lot of action this last turn, kind of gearing up for things that are to come. Africa, almost exclusively in control of the Central Powers. This Ottoman force making its way around up into Morocco and Algeria, so they'll start taking some money away from the French. The American force kind of stranded in Africa, just trying to stay one step ahead of that force because there's not enough for them to take on the Turks. Over in Turkey, gearing up for a big showdown, quite possibly here on turn 18. The British abandoned Persia and pulled back into India and then spent their entire build in India. That's 10 men. Had to break out some different chips because I was out of the chips of the game supplies. So we're using some these blue, lighter blue colored chips that are from historical board gaming. And then with Persia abandoned, the Turks moved up their entire force there. So that's going to be quite the showdown. I think it's about a 50-50 proposition. We'll see. The Turks actually bought 3 transports this time. So, and 6 men. So now they'll have to brave the mines here in Sea Zone 17 if they want to come out here. But if they do, they now have a potential land on the boot of Italy or maybe in Africa to kind of squeeze this U.S. force that's in Algeria between the force that lands and the force over here in French West Africa. So the Turks have a couple of options, and there's no Allied ships at all in the Med. Over on the Western Front, the Western Allies got some good things going on here. That's about the only good news they have really in the game. The British are up into Belgium with a decent infantry force. The French got a lot of tanks, men, and artillery coming right behind. And then the U.S. has kind of built up a decent army in southern France here. So they've got 3 territories worth of units, tanks, artillery, men, and even a couple of planes. So they might wait a turn or two, get all of these units combined into one territory, and then maybe move into Piedmont because Austria-Hungary is right at the doorstep. They're in Venice, ready to maybe go into Tuscany, and all the Italians have their infantry. So we'll see. All of the Allied warships combined into Sea Zone 9 here, so that's more than enough to discourage the German High Seas Fleet from coming out, so that's still bottled up in the Baltic there. The Germans, and again, you'll see these are different ships, use these red ships. Again, they're from Historical Board Gaming. And the Germans put down just all infantry and men. They're probably going to pull back from the Ruhr, so that'll give that to the Western Allies, at least temporarily. And the Germans will pull back and combine all their units into one territory, so that'll be quite formidable. Austria-Hungary just continues to drop stuff, infantry and artillery. They're kind of going for broke now with as far as taking on Italy, because on the Eastern Front, we had saw Moscow had fallen a couple of turns ago, and now the Central Powers have kind of got this British force trapped here. So that those British units will be killed on this turn, and that will leave the entire Eastern Front, all of Russia, in the control of the Central Powers, with really no chance of the Allies getting back into Russia, probably for the rest of the game. So with that flank secure, the Central Powers can really concentrate on Western Europe. So as far as economically, that really kind of tells us the tale. Besides militarily, what's going on the board. The top three money makers continue to be the Central Powers. $47 for Austria-Hungary, $39 apiece for Germany and the Ottoman Empire. Russia out of it, Italy down to $10 and pretty much out of it. They just buy infantry and sit in Rome, really. And that leaves really all the heavy fighting to the U.S., British, and French. The French bringing in 28, the British 25, and the U.S. 20. So just not bringing in nearly as much as the Central Powers goes a long way to explain why the game is starting to tilt heavily into the Central Powers' control. Not ready to throw in the towel quite yet, but with each passing turn, it's looking more and more like this is going to be a Central Powers victory. Just completed turn 18, and the big news was Rome fell this turn. The Turks came over. They had bought in 3 transports the last turn. They brought their 6 men over. Rome just had 3 infantry there. The mines took out Turk sub, and that was it. Everything else survived. So the 6 men were able to get, and the battleship did an offshore bombardment, took out 1 of the infantry, and then the 6 Turk infantry got 2 hits. So that took Rome. So that's the second capital. Now, this doesn't mean victory. The Central Powers do need 2 capitals, but one of them has to be either Paris or London. So it didn't seal the deal as far as a Central Power victory. But $3 for the territory, the $11 the Italians had in the bank, and pretty much just on the verge of completely eliminating another of the Allied powers. So it's still a big deal. Also on Austria-Hungary's turn earlier in the round, they moved into Tuscany. They got 18 hits on the Italian infantry that were there. And because of the tanks they have absorbing hits, only had to lose 5 infantry in return. So plus 13 casualty round for Austria-Hungary. So then the Italians, you cannot move out of a contested territory unless you are moving into a territory of your own that isn't enemy occupied. So the Italian infantry that was in Tuscany couldn't come down into Rome, so they just moved down into Naples. There's no more room for them to run, though. They're stuck at the bottom of the boot there. So it's this turn, Austria-Hungary will move into Naples. Maybe not completely take out that Italian force. There's about 15 infantry left, but definitely will whittle it down. And Italy's all but out of the game. So now that leaves a 3-on-3 contest, and the 3 Central Powers, all of them collecting much more money than any of the Allies are. So it's just going to be a matter of time, kind of a slogging match to see how long it's going to take the Central Powers to get to Paris. That's still quite a ways off, but I really don't see how the Allies can turn the table here with Italy about to be completely eliminated. Over here in India and Persia, both sides kind of just still staring at each other. The British had to spend everything in India again, so that's a huge stack of men. That's their second stack. They've also got even actually a bigger stack of men next to it. The Turks brought up more units into Persia, so I'm thinking this turn one or the other will attack. Britain will either go into Persia or the Turks will go into India, one or the other. That looks to be a really good contest, about 50-50, but the Ottomans are collecting way more money than the British, nearly double actually. So this will be another case of just being a matter of time before the Ottomans overwhelm India, just based on sheer economies. And by tying down the British and forcing them to spend everything in India, they're obviously not spending anything on the Western Front either. So that's kind of like doing double the damage to the Allied cause. Africa, still the same thing. The U.S. trying to get away. This Turkish force just moving up, taking empty territories worth $1 at a time. The U.S. continues to shuttle units over. They combined everything they had in the south of France into Marseille. So they got a decent force there, and they're bringing over more. Will land on the French coast this next turn. On the Western Front, the Germans pulled everything back into Hanover. So they just left a man each in these border territories with France, pulled everything into Hanover. So now if the Allies get adjacent to the territory here in Hanover, the Germans are going to come out, and they've got quite the force. They've got about 20 infantry, about 20 artillery, and about 15 tanks. And they've got another 10 infantry and 3 more artillery in Berlin. So again, neither side kind of wants to venture out yet, because then the French here in Picardy have quite the force themselves, about 25 infantry, 10 artillery, and about 15 tanks. So it's going to be just a question of who's going to blink first and move out, because obviously whoever moves out first to an adjacent territory, they're not going to do any damage to the other side because the territory's kind of vacant. So then that means they'll be next door to the other power when that other power gets their turn, so they can go in first, which is a big deal because, again, both sides have quite a few tanks, and tanks absorb hits only on the attack. So you definitely, when both sides have an abundance of tanks, which both Germany and France do, you want to be getting your hit in first so that your tanks absorb almost all the hits the opponent gets, whereas you can deal out quite a bit of damage because the defending tanks will not absorb any of those hits. So again, it's just going to be a question of who blinks first. The problem with the Allies is they don't really have the time to sit and wait and just let the Germans build up unmolested. Again, the Central Powers are all collecting way more money than the Allies, so even though you don't want to, as France, move any further and risk getting counterattacked from that huge German force in Hanover, you might have to, just because, again, economically things have been tilted so far in the Central Powers balance that it's not going to really make a lot of sense just to sit around and wait. The navies, nothing happening there. They're both kind of staring at each other. Possibly have the Allies could go in and attack that German fleet. The British, French, and the U.S. all have decent naval units there, but the German fleet's bottled up, not really doing anything, not bothering anybody, so why? Not really makes a lot of sense to do it, to be honest with you. That's where things stand at the end of turn 18. See how much longer the Allies can hold on. So turn 19 has been completed, and with each passing turn, the game tilts more and more into the Central Powers' favor. Honestly, I could probably call the game at this point. I don't really see how the Allies are going to win, but we're going to play it out a little bit longer here. The Central Powers haven't officially won the game. They do own two of the Allied capitals, Rome and Moscow, but the rules call for them to have two capitals, but one of them has to be either London or Paris. So, but Austria-Hungary came down into Naples and finished off the Italians, so they're down to a transport on the board, and that's it. So, in essence, the Central Powers have eliminated two of the five Allied powers, Russia and Italy. On the Western Front, Germany has stacks of units all over the place here. Men, artillery, tanks, all of those territories that have those units are adjacent to the Ruhr here. So if the Allies were to take the bait and go into the Ruhr, the Germans can counterattack from all three of these territories, and there's a lot of stuff there. So not sure the Allies are going to take that bait. The French, or most of their forces, are centered in Picardy. They do continue to pump out infantry, but now with Italy taken out, Austria-Hungary is going to make their way back up the boot. They've already got a bunch of units here in Venice, more coming from Tyrolia and Vienna. So now the French are going to have to worry about an invasion of France through the territory adjacent to Italy. So that's why the U.S. is kind of concentrating all their units in Marseille, but the U.S. isn't going to be able to hold off Austria-Hungary. So you're probably, within the next couple of turns, going to see a dual invasion of France up north from the Germans and down south from Austria-Hungary, and the two of them combined are more than a match for the Allies. So it's only going to be a matter of time, I think, before Paris falls. Down in North Africa, that conquest is almost complete. The Turks landed the units they had in Rome on transports, landed them here in Libya. So now this force of a single French infantry, U.S. infantry, and a few tanks are now caught between these two Ottoman forces. So on this turn coming up, that will probably see the complete conquest of Africa. And the other big news was in Persia. The British came in, wanted to get their attack in first to take advantage of their tanks being able to absorb hits. And they did get about 18 hits on the Turks, so they lost 18 infantry. But then the Turks then counterattacked on their turn, and they took a ton of units off of the British. So after just one round of combat, Persia is tilting very heavily in the Turks' favor. The British have 1 infantry, 2 fighters, about 10 artillery, and about 10 tanks left, whereas the Turks have about 8 infantry, about 15 tanks, and about 20 artillery. And the Turks have more coming. Some units both in Ankara and Constantinople. The British, again, had to put all their build in India, but British will probably end up pulling back and just turtling up in India, and then it's only going to be a matter of time. Again, financially, things are like so far tilted in the Central Powers' favor. Austria-Hungary leads the way with $53. The Turks are next at 42, the Germans at 38. So, and now we're down to a 3-on-3 contest. French at 29, British just at 21, and the U.S. at 20. So again, we're going to play it out a little bit longer, a few more turns. I'd like to see an official victory here, so that means Paris would have to fall. But does not look like the Allies are going to be able to come back. We'll see what happens after turn 20. Turn 20 is now complete, and the writing's been on the wall for the last couple turns, but I can pretty much say unequivocally that this is going to be a Central Powers victory. Just a matter of probably a few more turns. On the Western Front, pretty much no activity here. It was all pretty much just each country buying units and fortifying what they had. The Germans probably are going to make a move into the Ruhr this next turn. They've got so much coming from all three of these territories that border the Ruhr that I don't really see the French probably even counterattacking into the Ruhr. That's just so much stuff. Austria-Hungary moved up from Naples, moved some more stuff into Venice. They've got quite the force ready to invade southern France. So it's two huge offensives in the north from the Germans and the south from Austria-Hungary. And the Allies don't have really the power to probably repel either one, let alone both of them. The U.S. landed more units, beefing up Marseille. The British pulled back from Holland, so they're combined with that. It's a large French force in Picardy, but still just not enough to stand up to Germany. And the French bought just infantry, moved some infantry around, and that was about it. So probably this next turn, both Austria, Hungary, and Germany will start the process of moving forward. And I just don't see how the Allies can resist. The U.S. bought some more men and artillery, probably not going to make really any difference. And they're going to continue to shuttle units across. Africa completely fell. The last Allied territory, Tunisia, fell to the Turks, so they own all of Africa now, except for the territories that belong to originally to other Central Power units. In India, the other bad news, the British could have pulled back from Persia into India, but then the Turks would have just been able to attack into India this turn, and without attacking themselves, the British wouldn't have been able to take advantage of their tanks being able to absorb hits. So they went ahead and attacked into Persia again, and they did do about 14 casualties to the Turks without suffering any in return, because again, their tanks absorbed everything. So that was the good news, but the Turks just still had so much left. That's still nearly 20 artillery, 15 tanks. So the Turks attacked on their part of the turn and wiped out all of the artillery, all but one man, and even got into about 5 or 6 of the tanks. So really, maybe another turn or two, and then India will probably fall, and that'll leave this whole section of the board here from Russia down to the Middle East, down to Africa, up through Italy, all under the control of the Central Powers. So, and then economically, Britain is at 21, the U.S. at 20, and the French are even down to 25. So a combined $66 for the three remaining Allied powers. Austria-Hungary is not far behind just them themselves at $56. So going to continue to play it out here a little bit, but don't expect any kind of change in fortune for the Allies. Another thing that they're going to have to worry about now is because the Turks can see that they've got more than enough units already on the board to take India. They spent all their money on naval units, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and they already have 3 subs, 2 cruisers, and a battleship on the board in Sea Zone 17. So this they'll combine these 2 fleets together and start moving out. They will have to face the mines here in Sea Zone 16 because Marseille is still under French control. But once they get there, they can come out in the Atlantic and they can start disrupting the U.S., taking out all their transports and preventing the U.S. from even reinforcing Western Europe if the game continues that far. See how things look after turn 21. So turn 21 is now in the books, and I think we can safely say this is going to be a Central Power victory. I know I said this for the last couple of turns, but it really is going to happen. I figure it's going to take about another 4 or 5 turns to actually finish the game just to make it official in terms of taking Paris. But there's no way the Allies are coming back. The Turks went into India because the British had pulled back, and they are left. The British are left with just 4 tanks, a man, and a fighter. So India is going to become part of the Ottoman Empire here on turn 22. The Turks also built all ships again, 2 battleships, 3 subs, They moved this huge navy into Sea Zone 16 here. That's 4 cruisers, 3 battleships, 3 subs, and the mines did not even get one single hit. On the Western Front, Austria-Hungary moved everything into Piedmont. So they've got a huge force there. The U.S. going to try to protect Marseille as much as they can, but Austria-Hungary just got way too much. The Germans moved everything into the Ruhr. The French and the British pulled back from Belgium. And again, that's a stack of about 25 artillery, 20, 30 men, about 20 tanks, more coming. Just way too much. The French are just building all infantry. Now that India is about to fall, the British will start putting all their money back in London. But with this Ottoman Empire Navy about to make its way out of the Med on this next turn, the U.S. has got to build some ships now to protect their transports. That pulled the U.S. fleet away from outside of London. So now the Allies are weakened up there. Maybe give the Germans the idea of they're going to venture out now. So even the naval combat, I think, is going to start swinging in the Central Powers' favor. See what happens after turn 22. Turn 22 is in the books, and the inexorable march of the Central Powers on Paris has begun. The Germans moved up into Belgium. The French and the British pulled back from Picardy. The Austro-Hungarians went into Marseille, totally routed the Americans. They were left with like 6 tanks and a man. The French came down to kind of back up the U.S. a little bit, and they got completely crushed. So the French have pulled back into Paris. They do have 2 stacks of men, probably a total of about 45, 50 men, about 15 artillery, about 20 tanks, but 2 huge armies from the Germans in the north and the Austro-Hungarians in the south. It'll take a couple of turns for the Central Powers to get to Paris, but once they do, it's going to be over. The Germans built all ships, so they've got quite the high seas fleet going. I'm assuming that will make its way out into the Atlantic this turn. The Allies pulled their ships over to this side of Wales to avoid the Germans. But then, as you can see, the Ottomans have made their way out of the Med, and they are now in the Atlantic. That's a fleet of 3 battleships, 3 subs, and 4 cruisers. And then they have 2 more battleships and 3 more subs right behind it. So the U.S. bought ships this turn, and now the U.S. is actually in danger of losing their fleet off the coast of the United States. Austria-Hungary built 2 battleships. Pretty much the Central Powers feel like they have enough ground units in Europe to take Paris. So pretty much all 3 of the Central Powers are just spending their money on building up their navies. In India did fall. The Turks finished off the British there. So knocked the British down 4. The Ottomans went up $4. So now all of Africa, all of the Mideast, and all of Russia, and Italy for that matter, is all Central Power controlled right now. So the Allies just barely holding on. Financially, it's just as grim for them as it is militarily. Austria-Hungary up to $59, the Turks up to $49, the Germans at $45, and the U.S. is actually leading the way for the Allies at just $20. France is down to 19, and Britain's down to 14. So just a matter of time. We're about to start turn 23. I figure it won't go much past turn 25. Turn 23 is complete. The Central Powers trying to continue to inch their way towards Paris. The French did come out with quite a bit of a force into Picardy. The reason for that is the French have about 15 tanks, and on offense only, tanks can absorb hits. So instead of just holding up in Paris and not taking advantage of the tanks being able to absorb hits on offense, the French ventured out and went into Picardy. They did inflict quite a few casualties on the Germans. I think the Germans ended up losing about 27 infantry. but they didn't even touch this stack of artillery, and it's 29. The French lost about 20 infantry in returns. They still have quite a bit there. They still have about 25 men, 15 tanks, and about 10 artillery. But it's only a matter of time. The Germans will definitely attack on this turn, and they've got about 15 of their own tanks to absorb hits, so they're going to whittle that down quite a bit. Austria-Hungary is in full control of Marseille, and they've got quite a bit there, so they'll move up one territory. They'll be at the doorstep of Paris this next turn. So even if the Germans can't clear Picardy, and that's still contested, Austria-Hungary will be right at the door to Paris. So Paris will be attacked on the following turn, which will be turn 25. So we might see the end of the game at that point. I would say turn probably 26 at the latest. Again, the Central Powers just built a bunch of naval units. They don't even need any more ground units to take Paris. The German High Seas Fleet came up here into Sea Zone 5, so they're going to make their way over probably on this next turn and attack this British-French fleet. The Turks came out, so they're at the mouth of the Mediterranean with 5 battleships, 5 subs, and 4 cruisers, so they're ready to possibly take on the U.S. fleet outside of Washington. And both the Turks and Austria-Hungary also have a couple of fleets each, or a fleet each, in Sea Zone 16. Everything else about the same. Africa, Russia, India, all still completely under Central Power control. Allies probably only got a couple of turns left. Turn 24 is in the books, and I think we're pretty much on the verge of a complete Central Powers victory. Not sure what's even going to go, if it'll go past turn 25 here coming up. So pretty much all the action is confined now to Western Europe and some naval action. So in Western Europe, the Austro-Hungarian army moved up another territory. So now they're right at the doorstep at Paris with 2 adjacent territories full of units. Probably going to be enough. Not sure they're going to take out everything in Paris this turn, so that's why it might go another turn beyond. But Austria-Hungary's got enough. Plus, Germany's still got a huge stack of artillery and tanks. There's 1 French infantry left in Picardy, so the Germans will take that, and that territory will now become uncontested, and they'll be right at the doorstep to Paris as well. So I'm figuring maybe 2 turns for the Central Powers to finish off Paris. Both the French and the British just bought infantry. Germans moved their High Seas Fleet up, so they are on the verge of a major naval engagement with the combined British-French fleet. Major naval engagement happened off of the east coast of the United States. The Turks came over with their navy. They've got 4 cruisers left and completely wiped out the U.S. Navy. And the Turks have more coming, including transports with 6 men. So the U.S. had to respond by just buying as many men as they can and placing them in the United States. So even the U.S. is now in danger of being invaded, although I don't think the Turks will have quite enough to make a successful invasion of the United States. Other than that, not a lot happened. Again, it was all confined to one big naval clash and the advance towards Paris. See if the Allies can even hold out for a couple more turns. Turn 25 complete, and defeat is right around the corner for the Allies. You know it's a bad Axis and Allies 1914 game for the Allies, the Entente, when you see Turks in Ireland. So yeah, that kind of sums it all up for the Allies in this game. Paris is now contested. Austria-Hungary moved into there with substantial force, took out about 35 Allied units. The Allies sacrificed all the British and American units, so the French are all that's left defending Paris. They don't even have enough to survive this one more round. Even if somehow they survive what Austria-Hungary is going to throw at them, the Germans are now in Picardy, uncontested, right next door to Paris. So Paris will fall this turn, 26, and that'll officially end the game. Had a major naval engagement outside of Wales. The German High Seas Fleet finally got into some action, completely wiped out the combined French and British fleets. The U.S. just holed up in the United States, bought men, not in danger of being invaded, but the game will end long before then anyways. And the Central Powers, all three of them, didn't even bother to spend any of their money this turn. So we'll be back at the end of turn 26. So that is it. The game ends on turn 26. The Central Powers are victorious. This is my first time playing, so I think usually the Allies come out on top in this game. So I don't know if maybe I'm just not a proper Allied strategist, or if the die roll went substantially in the Central Powers' favor. But the Central Powers did win. Paris is completely under Austria-Hungary's control. And then Germany also has a substantial force right next door. The only thing the Allies even have left on the board is infantry in the United States and infantry in London. So no chance of the Allies reclaiming Paris. So the Central Powers ended up taking three of the five Allied capitals: Moscow, Naples, or Rome, Moscow, and Paris. As far as kind of surprises or comments about it, the Ottomans had a really good game. They finished with, they're up to $50. They have all of Africa under their control. They took India and even had been venturing out into the Atlantic with substantial naval forces. Austria-Hungary is in the lead. They're up to like $71, counting the fall of Paris. Plus, they could have taken Brest if they wanted as well. So they're far and away the economic leader. And actually, Germany was in third place among the Central Powers with $49. So I think the Central Powers strategy, they kind of held in the West and went for Moscow. I think that paid dividends. The thinking there was get Russia under control, not have to worry about the Eastern Front, and again, just kind of hold in the West. And then once Moscow was taken, to then focus your attention back to the Western Front. I think that worked out well. Instead of fighting on two fronts, just give it all you got to take out the Russians and then turn your attention west. And really in the West, the U.S. doesn't enter the game until turn 4, so you don't have to worry about them for several turns. Italy just isn't really strong enough to do much. And then that would just leave the French and the British. And as the Central Powers, you should be able to fight a delaying action against them, especially as the British are going to be splitting their money between London and India, maybe even in some cases putting more money into India. So it really could come down to, a half-hearted British effort and a full French effort against the delaying actions of Austria-Hungary and Germany. So I think that is definitely doable if you want to go ahead again and take out the Russians first and just secure the Eastern Front. As far as the Turks go, they also played well. The strategy of coming down into Africa, I was like kind of on the fence with that as the game progressed, because if you take a look here in Africa itself, none of these territories, with the exception of Egypt, are worth more than $1. So, I mean, even if you do get control of all of Africa, it's not going to really tip the balance of power too much in the Turks' favor. And when Constantinople was close to being besieged, and then I had a substantial Turk force down in Africa, I thought, well, maybe that was a mistake to go down there. These obviously units, besides the fighter, can only move one space at a time. So if you do get too deep into Africa as the Turks and you find Constantinople being threatened, you're just not going to be able to move these units back up into Transjordan and back up into Turkey itself. So I thought that was kind of a mistake. But again, the British having to spend part of their money in India and part of it in London meant that once the British started making some inroads into Mesopotamia, the Turks just spent all their money in buying infantry and some artillery, and that was enough to hold off the British and then even eventually counterattack and push the British out of Mesopotamia into Persia and then eventually into India itself. So I thought that was a good strategy from the Turks overall. Austria-Hungary, again, they assisted with the Germans. It wasn't just a one-country effort in terms of taking out Moscow. They both had a hand. The first attempts to take Moscow, probably around turn 4 or 5, it was the Russians survived. And again, it looked like that might be kind of a turning point, because even though Russia wasn't really doing anything offensively, they were just, able to just buy more and more men and artillery and place them in Moscow. But the Allies were just never really able to apply any pressure, at least any significant pressure to the Central Powers in Western Europe. So the Russians were just kind of holed up in Moscow, and it was just in a matter of time before the Central Powers launched another assault, and Moscow did end up falling the second time, which was probably around turn 15 or so, 12 or 15, somewhere along there. Italy never could really do much for the Allies either. They're not that strong. They only start off with, I think, like $14 or $16, something like that. So they're the weakest of the Allied forces. And again, Austria-Hungary just kind of blocked them in Tyrolia and Trieste until Russia fell. And then they concentrated all their forces on taking out Italy. Now, once Moscow fell, it wasn't necessary to take Rome and knock the Italians out, because the second capital of the two that you need to capture, the second one has to be either London or Paris. So once the Central Powers had Moscow, Rome wasn't necessary to take, but at the same time, they were holding their own in Western Europe here, and the Austro-Hungarians had more than enough to go into Italy, so why not? It still takes out another Allied power. Basically, you can free up the Mediterranean for your own ships, and they took the money off of Italy once they captured Rome as well. So it was kind of a bonus, but it's not like it detracted the Central Powers from the main mission of taking out Paris. And as you can see, once the Med was under the control of the Central Powers, they were able to freely move their ships. And for the last probably 5-6 turns or so, Austria-Hungary and the Turks were pretty much buying all naval units. And they've now made their way out here and have completely boxed up both the United States and Britain. So even if this game was to continue, neither the British or Americans can even get any units back into Europe because of the complete control of the Atlantic by the Central Powers. So that was pretty much a recap of how things went. I'm kind of curious to get back into another game of this to see if this is going to be like a typical thing, because again, I've mostly seen the Allies winning this. So I wonder if this is just like anomaly, that the Central Powers were so strong. Even in games I've seen where the Central Powers, do hold their own and maybe eke out a victory, the Turks are never this strong as they are at this game. So not sure if that was just kind of a bungled strategy on the Allied part, or if it's something that you can actually have the Turks doing on a regular basis. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back hopefully soon with another game. Take care.